Hi everyone, in this video we're diving into skeletal muscle metabolism. In other words, we're asking ourselves, how do muscle cells create ATP and how does that link with fatigue as well as different muscle fiber types? Specifically, we're looking at three ways in which a muscle fiber can regenerate the ATP during contraction, and we'll compare and contrast them. We're also going to introduce three different types of muscle fibers, and we'll see how they differentiate through their cross-bridge cycling rate, their resistance to fatigue, their preferred metabolism, and other characteristics. And finally, we'll talk about fatigue and what actually causes fatigue in skeletal muscle cells. Why is it that after sustaining a contraction for a given amount of time, we can no longer do so? Let's get started. So we've already established through other lectures that in order to contract, skeletal muscles require ATP. Just to remind you of a few examples here, skeletal muscles need ATP for myosin ATP, which is necessary for the cross-bridge cycling. Muscle cells need ATP to power our calcium ATPase, which is necessary for relaxation of the muscle, right? Bringing all the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And muscle cells, just like any other cells in our body, also need ATP for the sodium and potassium pump to function, just to maintain the ion gradients as they should be. So we know this. The piece of information that we might not be aware of yet, if you look at one of your muscle cells right now and the amount of ATP in that muscle cell, it's tiny. It's literally almost nothing. So if our body stopped producing ATP right now, we would have enough ATP to live for only 1 or 2 seconds. What does this tell us is that ATP is continuously regenerated in all of our cells, including our muscle cells. And some of these concepts will be reviewed from our cell metabolism unit. So muscle cells have 3 different ways to regenerate or to produce ATP: phosphocreatine, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. So let's look at this ATP regeneration process. So we know that in order to sustain its function, the muscle cells must use ATP and the high energy in ATP, hydrolyze it in order to form ADP and phosphate. Conversely, ATP must always be produced. So it's produced from ADP and it requires potential energy in order to bring it back to ATP. So when we're talking about ATP regeneration, we're really looking at this green pathway. So how do the cells take ADP and regenerate it to ATP? So that's what we're focusing on. There's 3 different ways. The first way is via phosphocreatine. So as the name says, phosphocreatine has a phosphorus group. And there's an enzyme called creatine kinase, or CK, that can break down the phosphate group on the phosphocreatine and basically give it to ADP in order to form ATP. So that's the first way that the cells can regenerate the ATP. The other way we've already talked about is anaerobic glycolysis. So that's a process of starting with glucose or glycogen, so one of the two, converting this into pyruvate and then into lactate. So the name here says it, anaerobic glycolysis means it's glycolysis happening under conditions where oxygen is limiting or does not require oxygen. And we've already discussed that this pathway produces 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose that's used. Our third and final system is the aerobic respiration. And that starts with either carbohydrates, so glucose or glycogen, or lipids, like triglycerides or fatty acids, which then enter the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. As you may remember, if we start with 1 molecule of glucose, this can create roughly 32 molecules of ATP. It actually creates way more if you start with lipids. So here are 3 different ways that our muscle cells can create ATP. Now we'll see that these systems are actually quite different and are not used under the same condition. So here are some of the key characteristics of each of these systems. First, I want to bring your attention to power. So that's the amount of calorie or the amount of ATP that can be created per minute. So basically, this column answers how quickly can ATP be produced by each of those systems. And you can see here that phosphocreatine is by far the winner in that category. So phosphocreatine has the ability to produce energy or produce ATP very, very quickly. However, the problem with phosphocreatine comes when you look at the next two columns. The total amount of ATP that can be created, so its capacity, and how long this system can last, or its duration. So what we see here is that phosphocreatine, and to a lesser extent anaerobic glycolysis, are systems that can create ATP relatively quickly, but that their capacity and duration is very limited. So the total amount of calories that one can create with phosphocreatine, it's 11 calories. It's not going to get you very far. Similar with anaerobic glycolysis, total amount that we have in our cells is only able to produce about 15 kilocalories. And consequently, these two systems last only for a short amount of time, 15 seconds and 40 seconds. So we can think of phosphocreatine and anaerobic glycolysis as systems that produce quick ATP, but with low capacity. And that is very different than what we see with aerobic respiration. So you can see that aerobic respiration has almost an unlimited capacity to produce ATP and can last for 60 minutes, 2 hours, depending on the individual, their training status, and so on. So think of aerobic respiration as a system that produces ATP more slowly, but with a very high capacity. And these concepts are also illustrated on the graph on the bottom right here. So on the y-axis, we have the capacity of the system, and on the x-axis, we have duration. This solid line here represents phosphocreatine. So it has the ability to produce ATP really, really quickly, but within about 10 to 15 seconds, its capacity is down to 0. The first dotted line here represents anaerobic glycolysis, and it's a similar pattern. It takes a little longer in order to get activated, but it's still activated within about 10 to 15 seconds, produces a lot of energy quickly, and then decreases its capacity pretty quickly. So within about a minute, we're already on the downslope for anaerobic glycolysis. And our final dotted line here is aerobic respiration. So we can first see that it takes a lot longer in order to reach its capacity, so about 2 or 3 minutes. But then after that, it's a flat line. So this graph only shows until 5 minutes, but if you extended it until 60 minutes or 120 minutes, you would still see a relatively flat line with regard to aerobic respiration. So based on this, my question to you is, which types of athletes do you think would benefit more from a very good anaerobic glycolytic system? And which types of athletes would benefit from a good aerobic respiration system? To answer these questions, we have to think about the amount of time that an athletic event would take, for instance. Anaerobic glycolysis gives you energy for, 1 to 2 minutes. So any athletic event that would fit within this time frame would be powered mostly through anaerobic glycolysis. You can think of, a 400 meter or 800 meter race on the track, for instance. You can think of some shorter distances in rowing, for instance. You could think of gymnastic routines that last about a minute to a minute and a half. All of those athletes will really train in order to maximize their anaerobic glycolysis system. In contrast, any athletic event that would last longer than that would require a good aerobic respiration system. So, the obvious ones, marathons, triathlons, any endurance sport that you can think of would be powered mostly by the aerobic respiration system. So far, through our discussion of skeletal muscle physiology, we assume that all muscle cells were exactly the same. And that is not the case. In humans, skeletal muscle cells come in at least 3 different types, which we call type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. So how do we differentiate between these classes? It's based on 2 main characteristics. First of all, which ATP regeneration system these cells use. Do they use oxygen in order to replenish ATP, or do they use anaerobic systems in order to replenish ATP. So that's the first factor that will differentiate between these muscle fiber types. And the second factor is the cross-bridge cycling rate. So in some cells, the cross-bridge cycle will happen quicker than in other cells. First of all, let's look at our 3 ATP regeneration system and remind ourselves which ones require oxygen and which ones don't. So based on the name, we know that anaerobic glycolysis does not require oxygen, so no need for O2. It's the same thing for phosphocreatine. Phosphocreatine can make ATP without oxygen. So we basically have 2 systems that are anaerobic that do not require oxygen, and we have 1 system here that requires oxygen, which is our aerobic respiration. We'll see it in the next slide, but I'm going to write it right away. Our type 1 fibers are fibers that are specialized in aerobic metabolism. So they will prefer to make ATP using aerobic respiration. In contrast, our type 2X fibers prefer to make ATP through anaerobic metabolism, either using phosphocreatine or using anaerobic glycolysis. And that's what we see here. So when we classify muscle fibers based on their preferred ATP regeneration system, we have some fibers that are specialized in producing ATP without oxygen. And these are our type 2X muscle fibers. And we have muscle cells that are specialized in producing ATP with oxygen, and that is our type 1 fibers. Now moving on to our cross-bridge cycling rate. So I've briefly mentioned that in some muscle cells, the cross-bridge cycling that has 5 steps occurs faster than in other types of muscles. So why is that? The rate at which the cycling occurs is based on the myosin ATPase. So this myosin ATPase has many different isoforms. So think of isoforms as almost cousins. They do the same function, but they may work a little differently. So in this case, we have an isoform or a cousin that's really, really quick at breaking down the ATP. Therefore, it allows the cross-bridge cycle to occur quicker. So your type 2X fibers do express that fast myosin ATPase that allows the breakdown of ATP quickly and therefore allows this fast cross-bridge cycling. In contrast, when you look at type 1 fibers, they express the slow cousin or the slow isoform of myosin ATPase. And as a result, it just takes a little bit more time to break down the ATP into ADP, and that slows down how quickly that cycle can occur. The second core difference between these fibers is that type 2X fibers produce contraction quicker than type 1 fibers. So here's the table that summarizes the characteristics of the type 1 and the type 2X fibers. First, you can see that the fiber types not only have a number, they also have a name. So the type 1 fibers are called the slow twitch oxidative fibers. And this name really ties in the 2 core characteristics of these fibers. They express the slow myosin ATPase and they produce ATP via oxidative metabolism. The type 2X fibers are also called the fast twitch glycolytic fibers because they express the fast myosin ATPase isoform and they prefer making ATP through either glycolysis or phosphocreatine. Now, so far, we haven't mentioned the third type of fiber, which is type 2A. Think of type 2A as an intermediate between the type 1 and the type 2X fiber. So type 2A fiber will have some of the characteristics of the type 1 fibers and some of the characteristics of the type 2X fibers. So that's why I have intermediate here for all of the characteristics. So it's basically a mix of both fibers. All right, so let's look at each individual characteristics here. The diameter of the muscle cell is smaller in the 1 versus the type 2X fibers. What about the myosin ATPase speed? We've already talked about this. Type 1 is slow, type 2X is fast. And this characteristic dictates how quickly that muscle fiber can contract. So type 1 fiber contracts relatively slower than a type 2X fiber. Metabolism. The type 1 uses aerobic metabolism, meaning it uses oxygen to make ATP, while the type 2X fibers uses anaerobic metabolism. So these are the core characteristics we've already talked about. Now there's a few other rows in this table that are characteristics that are associated with the metabolism of each of the fiber types. So let's take type 1 fibers, for instance. So we know that they prefer to make ATP via aerobic metabolism, meaning that they require oxygen in order to do so. Because of that, they've evolved adaptations that helps oxygen get to the cell. For instance, they would have a much higher capillary density than their type 2X fibers. What does this mean? It means that oxygen, which is carried through the blood, can more easily reach those muscle cells. They also have high mitochondrial density. Why is that? Remember that your electron transport chain and your citric acid cycle required for aerobic metabolism take place in the mitochondria. Therefore, the more mitochondria the cell has, the greater its capacity for aerobic metabolism. Same thing with the enzymes. If you look inside a type 1 muscle cell, it expresses a lot of enzymes that are necessary for aerobic metabolism. So a lot of the enzymes for the citric acid cycle, a lot of the enzymes for the electron transport chain you would find there. In contrast, if you look at the enzyme in the type 2X fibers, what you find is a lot of the glycolytic enzymes. So the enzymes that you need for glycolysis. So to bring it all back together, really type 1 and type 2X fibers have different structures and different functions. Your type 2X fibers are the ones that will develop tension quickly and will be used for fast and powerful movement, jumping, sprinting, powerlifting, and so on. The drawback of these fibers is that they fatigue easily. And why do they fatigue easily? Because the systems that they rely on to make ATP have limited capacity. Remember, phosphocreatine is only good for about 10 to 15 seconds, and aerobic glycolysis is good for about 40 seconds to a minute. In contrast, your type 1 or slow twitch oxidative fibers will develop tension more slowly, and they'll be used for longer sustained movement. So we can think of, walking or cycling, but even just maintaining your posture right now requires muscle contractions. And these are muscles that will be active throughout the day as we go about our daily activities. So these muscles will have a high proportion of type 1 muscle fibers, which are very much fatigue resistant. So when we talk about type 1 and type 2X muscle fibers, we're talking about individual muscle cells. In most of our muscles as human, we have a mix of type 1, type 2A, and type 2X fibers. However, the proportions are different. So we can have a muscle that would have 50% type 1, 50% type 2X, for instance, and another muscle that would have 20% type 2X and 80% type 1. So knowing this, let's look at this graph here. So what we're looking at here is tension on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So it's really looking at one twitch for different types of muscle. So that's an eye muscle in red, your gastrocnemius, which is one of your calf muscle in blue, and your soleus, which is another calf muscle in red. And what we see here is that one twitch is much shorter in the eye muscle than it is in the soleus muscle. So my question to you is, based on your knowledge of muscle fiber types, could you hypothesize which muscle has the greatest proportion of type 1 fibers and which muscle has the greatest proportion of type 2X fibers? So the first concept we have to remember here is our cross-bridge cycling rate. So remember that our type 1 fiber have a slow cross-bridge cycling rate, which means they're slow to develop tension, and they're also slower in decreasing tension. So everything about these type 1 fibers is slower. In contrast, your type 2X fibers have a fast myosin ATPase, so they can develop tension quickly, but that tension is also going to decrease quite quickly. So based on this, I'm sure that you guys hypothesize that your extraocular muscle that has a very, very short twitch has a high proportion of type 2X fibers. So that muscle specifically has lots of type 2X cells, which allows the tension to be created quickly as well as to decrease quickly. That's in contrast with our soleus, which would have a high proportion of type 1 fibers. And that's what we see, a much longer twitch in the soleus muscle. And finally, your gastrocnemius would probably have about half and half, 50% of your type 2X and 50% of your type 1 cells. Before we move on to the next concept here, I want us to think about the adaptations that are necessary for type 1 fibers to produce ATP through aerobic respiration. So we've already established that those slow twitch oxidative fibers require oxygen to produce ATP, which means that there is a need for oxygen to first be delivered to the muscle fibers. So the oxygen has to get to those muscles. But even once it's there, oxygen still needs to diffuse through the cell to reach the mitochondria, which is where the electron transport chain takes place. And this is where we need oxygen in order to produce ATP. So to get that oxygen there, first to the muscle and then to the mitochondria, the type 1 fibers have specific characteristics that will ensure oxygen delivery to the mitochondria. So what are those? First one, they have a high capillary density. This just means that there's more blood vessels around a type 1 muscle cell than around a type 2X muscle cell. The second characteristic is their small diameter. How does this help? Type 1 fibers are smaller, which decreases the distance that oxygen has to diffuse to reach the mitochondria. Remember that diffusion is only efficient across a really, really small distance. So as the type 1 fibers are smaller, oxygen doesn't have to diffuse that long to reach the mitochondria and therefore makes oxygen transport much more efficient. The third one is a new one. It's the presence of myoglobin. So myoglobin is a protein. It's actually a protein that binds oxygen. And the simplest way to think about myoglobin is to think about hemoglobin first. So most of us are familiar with the fact that in our blood, hemoglobin is a protein that binds oxygen and then carries oxygen. Myoglobin does a very similar thing, but instead of being located in the blood, it's located in our skeletal muscle. So myoglobin is inside the sarcoplasm, and as oxygen is delivered through the muscle via the capillary, oxygen can bind to myoglobin. And basically, myoglobin acts as a transfer molecule where it takes oxygen close to the sarcolemma, close to the plasma membrane, and brings it inside closer to the mitochondria. And that really increases the oxygen transport rate in type 1 fibers. And there's no or very little myoglobin in type 2X fibers because type 2X fibers don't need oxygen in order to produce ATP. So a simple way of thinking of myoglobin is really to think about it as a transfer molecule for oxygen. It takes oxygen from the sarcolemma and brings it into the sarcoplasm closer to the mitochondria. Our last important concept here is muscle fatigue. We've all experienced it before, either at the gym or during a day of physical labor. And by definition, muscle fatigue is the inability of a muscle to continue to either generate or sustain muscle tension. And honestly, researchers up to this point can't agree or can't tease apart the exact causes of fatigue. What we do have is a lot of factors that are associated with fatigue, but we're still unsure about which factor actually cause or lead to fatigue. But broadly, the factors that are associated with fatigue can be classified into two categories: central fatigue and peripheral fatigue. Central fatigue is all of the factors that are associated with the central nervous system, as the name says. Peripheral fatigue is all the factors that are associated with the somatic motor neuron, as well as the muscle cell itself. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. On the left here, we have a map of what's required for a skeletal muscle contraction. So when you contract a muscle, you first make a conscious decision, and that's part of your central nervous system. There's neurons inside your brain that then activate other neurons inside of your spinal cord, and all of those still reside within the central nervous system. At one point, the neuron within the spinal cord synapses with the somatic motor neuron, and that leads to all of the events that we talked about. The neuromuscular junction, the excitation-contraction coupling, the calcium signal, the cross-bridge cycling, and so on. So as you can see here, anything above the dotted line, because it stems from the central nervous system. Anything below that dotted line falls under the peripheral fatigue. It's either associated with the somatic motor neuron or the muscle cell itself. And as I said, I don't have a strong answer for you as to what causes fatigue. But what's really important in this course is to understand that disruption in basically any of the processes that we've talked about to produce contraction could lead to or could be associated with fatigue. So starting with what happens at the neuromuscular junction, a decrease in acetylcholine release or acetylcholine synthesis, or a decrease in the ability of acetylcholine to bind to its receptor would be plausible factors associated with fatigue. Moving on to excitation-contraction coupling. If the membrane potential of the muscle change, it might be harder to reach threshold and to activate this muscle cell. That could lead to fatigue too. Moving on to our calcium signal. Any problem that would result in a lack of calcium release, either because of a leak, either because of the RYR protein not opening properly, or because of a decreased affinity between calcium and troponin, once again, all of those would be plausible factors explaining fatigue. And finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about these depletion and accumulation theories. When we talked about type 2X fibers, we talked about how phosphocreatine and anaerobic glycolysis through glycogen have limited capacity. So it is plausible that in these types of fibers, a lack of glycogen or a lack of phosphocreatine would compromise the ability to sustain a muscle contraction. But here's a question for you guys. Is fatigue caused by a lack of ATP in the cell? And most evidence so far say that no, fatigue is not associated with a lack of ATP. What we see actually is that even when you produce muscle contraction to your maximum capacity, the concentration of ATP in the cell barely changes. So that's one thing that's really, really tightly regulated, and we basically always have ATP in our cells. Now, different muscle fibers fatigue at different rates. So can you identify on these graphs which one represents the type 1 fibers, the type 2A fibers, and the type 2X fibers? So first of all graphs are organized the same way, where tension on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis. And you can see that we have a fiber type here that's able to sustain contraction for 60 minutes and even longer. In contrast, we have a fiber type here that produces a lot of tension early on, but then fatigues really, really quickly. So if you remember well our discussion of muscle fiber types, your type 2X fibers are the ones that fatigue very quickly, while your type 1 fibers are the ones that are very fatigue resistant. And as we know, your type 2A fibers are the fibers that have an intermediate phenotype. So they are more fatigue resistant than type 2X, but not as fatigue resistant as type 1 fibers.